Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to care when everything inside you says to walk away. In 1870s Arizona territory, Apache warrior Taza has buried his wife, his children, and his hope for peace between two worlds. He wanders the desert alone, avoiding the white settlements that have taken everything from him. Then he hears a child's desperate cry. A small settler girl kneels beside her unconscious mother outside a broken homestead, begging anyone who will listen for help. Taza should keep walking. His people and hers are enemies. But the child's tears break through his walls of grief and anger. Against every instinct, he stays. What happens next is a story of two wounded souls finding healing in the most unlikely place. Can a warrior who has lost everything learn to trust again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly under a relentless sun, its red earth cracked and thirsting for mercy that rarely came. In this harsh landscape, where saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels and mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, survival was earned one day at a time. The year was 1873, and the desert had become a battlefield where two peoples fought not just for land, but for the right to call any place home. Taza moved through this wilderness with the fluid grace of a man born to it. At 52, his weathered face bore the lines of countless suns and too many sorrows. His long black hair, now streaked with silver, hung in a single braid down his back, adorned with a small eagle feather, the last gift from his youngest son before the cavalry came. His clothes were a mixture of Apache tradition and necessity. Buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt traded from Mexican merchants, and moccasins that made no sound on the hardest ground. But it was his eyes that told the truest story, dark pools that had once held warmth and laughter, now reflecting only the vast emptiness of loss. 2 years had passed since that terrible morning at Fort Apache. The memories still came to him in dreams, the sound of cavalry horses thundering across the dawn, the acrid smell of gunpowder, his wife Ayana's hand growing cold in his. She had been gathering pinon nuts with their children when Captain Morrison's patrol decided that any Apache away from the reservation was fair game. Taza had been hunting in the mountains, tracking a deer that would have fed his family for a week. Instead, he returned to find 3 graves that he dug with his own hands, his tears mixing with the red earth that covered all he had ever loved. The medicine pouch at his side held more than herbs and healing roots. It carried the weight of generations. His grandmother had sewn it from the hide of a deer that gave itself willingly. She always said, blessing each stitch with prayers in the old language. Inside were plants she had taught him to recognize as a boy. Osha root for fever, willow bark for pain, sage for purification of body and spirit. Healing is not just medicine, she had whispered during his training. It is the courage to touch another's pain and make it your own. Now, as he crested a low ridge and saw the broken homestead below, those words echoed in his mind like a challenge from the spirits. The structure was little more than 4 walls of adobe and timber, its roof partially collapsed, its door hanging askew on leather hinges. But it was the scene before it that stopped his breath. A little girl with hair the color of prairie grass knelt beside a woman who lay motionless on a blanket spread in the dirt. The child's dress was torn and stained, her face streaked with tears and dust. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her voice carried across the desert with the power of pure desperation. "Please, Mama, wake up. I brought you water like you said. Please don't leave me here alone." Taza's first instinct was to turn away. The woman was clearly a settler, and settlers had taken everything from him. Their kind had pushed his people onto barren reservations, had killed his family, had declared war on a way of life that had endured for countless generations. Every rational thought told him to disappear back into the desert and leave them to whatever fate had brought them to this desolate place. But the child's sobs reached something deeper than reason, touching a place in his heart that he thought had died with his own children. His daughter Naira would have been about this age now, would have had the same fierce determination in her voice when fighting for something she loved. The memory of Naira's laughter, bright as water over stones, made his chest tighten with familiar grief. Against his better judgment, Taza found himself moving down the slope, his feet choosing the path his mind resisted. As he drew closer, he could see the woman's condition more clearly. She was young, perhaps 30, with auburn hair darkened by sweat and fever. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin pale except for the flush of illness across her cheeks. The child Grace, he would learn, had done her best to care for her mother, bringing water in a cracked pottery cup and arranging their few possessions nearby with touching precision. "Mama won't wake up," Grace said, without looking up, as Taza's shadow fell across them. Her voice was hoarse from crying, but she continued to stroke her mother's forehead with small, gentle hands. "She's been sleeping for 2 days, but it's not a good sleep. She makes noises like she's scared, and she's too hot. And she won't drink the water no matter how many times I try." Taza knelt slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had learned to be careful around frightened creatures, and this child was clearly terrified, though she was trying to be brave. When Grace finally looked up and really saw him, her eyes widened with shock and fear. She scrambled backward, placing herself between Taza and her mother like a fierce little guardian. "Don't hurt us," she whispered, but there was steel in her voice. "We didn't do nothing wrong. Mama's sick, and we just need help." For a long moment, they stared at each other across a gulf that seemed wider than the desert itself. Taza saw in her eyes the same look he had given settlers, the expectation of violence, the learned fear that came from stories told around fires and in newspapers. But beneath that fear was something else, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, help could come from the most unlikely source. "I am not here to harm you, little one," Taza said quietly, his English careful but clear. He had learned the language from missionaries years ago, back when peace still seemed possible. "Your mother is very sick. Without help, she will not see another sunrise." Grace's lower lip trembled, but she lifted her chin with defiance that reminded him painfully of his own children. "Are you going to help her, or are you going to hurt us? Because if you're going to hurt us, I wish you'd just do it quick. I'm tired of being scared." The simple honesty of her words hit him like a physical blow. Here was a child who had been alone with her dying mother for days, who had probably heard terrible stories about his people, yet she was still hoping for mercy. It was the kind of courage that came not from the absence of fear, but from love. Stronger than terror. Taza reached slowly for his medicine pouch, watching Grace's reaction carefully. "My grandmother taught me the healing ways. If you will let me, I can try to help your mother. But I need to touch her, to see what spirit of sickness lives in her body." Grace hesitated, her small hands clenched into fists. Then she looked down at her mother's flushed face and made a decision that would change all their lives. "Okay, but if you hurt her, I'll fight you. I'm not very big, but I'll fight you anyway." "I would expect nothing less," Taza replied gravely. "A daughter who will not protect her mother is no daughter at all." As he moved closer to examine the unconscious woman, Taza caught the child's scent washed but fundamentally clean, carrying the smell of mesquite smoke and desert wind. She had been living rough for days, maybe weeks, surviving on whatever they had brought in their wagon and what little water they could find. The woman's condition was more serious. Her skin burned with fever, and when he lifted her eyelids, he could see the telltale cloudiness that spoke of infection deep in the body. His practiced hands found the source quickly, a wound in her side, poorly bandaged and festering with poison. It looked like a bullet graze, several days old, that had not been properly cleaned. Without treatment, the infection would kill her within hours. "What is your name, child?" he asked as he began unpacking his herbs. "Grace. Grace Miller." "This is my mama, Sarah. What's your name?" "I am called Taza." He began crushing osha root between two stones, the familiar motions bringing him a strange sense of peace. "How long has your mother been like this?" 3 days, I think, maybe 4. It's hard to tell when you're scared all the time. Grace watched his every movement with intense curiosity. "Are you really going to make her better?" Taza mixed the ground root with water from his own supply, creating a paste that would draw the poison from the wound. "I will try. But healing is not magic, Grace Miller. It requires time and patience. And sometimes it requires more courage than we think we possess." As he worked, cleaning the infected wound with careful precision, he found himself talking to a child in a way he hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 years. Grace asked endless questions about the herbs, about Apache healing, about whether he had children of his own. That last question brought silence that stretched long enough for the desert wind to whisper its secrets through the broken homestead. "I had children once," he finally said, applying the healing paste to Sarah's wound. "A son and a daughter. They walked the spirit path before their time." Grace absorbed this information with the solemn understanding that children develop when they've seen too much of life's harder truths. "I'm sorry they died. Were they nice?" "They were the light of my world," Taza admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. "My daughter would have liked you. She was brave like you, and she asked as many questions." As the afternoon wore on, Taza continued his ministrations while Grace helped by fetching water and watching her mother's face for any sign of improvement. The child's presence was both comfort and torment. Comfort because her innocence reminded him that not all human connections led to pain. Torment because every smile, every laugh, every moment of trust felt like a betrayal of his murdered family. When Sarah's fever finally broke near sunset, Grace cried with relief and threw her small arms around Taza's neck. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be needed, to be trusted, to be something other than a vessel for grief and rage. But as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he knew that morning would bring difficult choices. He had saved the woman's life, but now what? He couldn't leave them here to die, but he couldn't stay without putting them all in danger. The army was always searching for hostile Apache, and his presence would make Grace and her mother targets. Yet as he watched the child curl up beside her sleeping mother, using his own blanket for warmth, he realized that some bridges, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The desert night settled around them with its familiar sounds, the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through stone. But for the first time in 2 years, Taza was not alone with his ghosts. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Dawn came softly to the desert, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. Taza had not slept, keeping vigil over Sarah Miller as her body fought the infection that had nearly claimed her life. Grace had curled against his side, sometime during the night, seeking warmth and comfort from the only protector she had. The trust implicit in that small gesture both humbled and terrified him. Sarah's breathing had grown stronger with the passing hours, and the fever that had raged through her body had finally broken completely. As the first rays of sunlight touched her face, her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. For a moment, she simply stared at the unfamiliar sky, confusion clouding her features. Then she turned her head and saw Taza sitting beside her, and terror flooded her expression. She tried to scramble away, her movements weak and unsteady, but panic gave her desperate strength. "Grace, Grace, where are you?" Her voice was hoarse from fever, but the fear in it was sharp as a blade. "Mama?" Grace stirred awake instantly, launching herself toward her mother with the relief of a child who had been holding her breath for days. "Mama, you're awake. I was so scared, but Taza helped you. He made you better." Sarah's eyes darted between her daughter and the Apache warrior who sat calmly watching her distress. Her hand went instinctively to her side, where clean bandages now covered the wound that had been killing her. The medicine smell was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, carrying hints of earth and growing things. "What? Who is he?" "Grace, get away from him." Sarah struggled to sit up, her maternal instincts overriding her physical weakness. "We have to get away." "No, Mama, he's good. He saved you." Grace positioned herself firmly between her mother and any possible escape route, her small face set with stubborn determination. "He's been taking care of you all night, and he gave me his blanket, and he told me stories about healing plants. His name is Taza, and he's not scary at all." Taza remained motionless during this exchange, understanding the woman's fear but not taking offense at it. He had seen that look before in the eyes of captured settlers who expected torture and death at Apache hands. The newspapers and frontier stories had filled their minds with tales of savagery, most of them lies designed to justify the taking of Apache lands. "I mean you no harm, Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man comfortable with difficult situations. "Your daughter asked for help, and I gave it. Nothing more." Sarah's hand went to the simple gold wedding ring on her finger, twisting it nervously as she studied his face for signs of deception. It was then that Taza noticed the ring worn smooth by years of wear, clearly precious to her not for its modest value, but for what it represented. Love, commitment, the kind of bond that created families and held them together against all odds. "You're Apache," she said, not a question but an accusation. "Yes, my husband," she began, then stopped, her face crumpling with grief that was still fresh and raw. "My husband was killed by Apache 3 weeks ago, near Tucson. The soldiers said, there were no survivors." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of old wounds and new understanding. Taza felt the familiar guilt settle in his chest, the burden of collective responsibility that he carried for every act of violence committed by his people, just as she likely carried guilt for the crimes of hers. "I am sorry for your loss," he said finally, and meant it. "War makes orphans and widows of us all." "War?" Sarah's voice was bitter anger. "Is that what you call murder? Slaughtering innocent people who were just trying to build a life." Tears began streaming down her face, 2 years of suppressed grief and fear finally finding voice. He was a good man. He never hurt anyone. He was bringing supplies to the Apache children at the mission school, for God's sake. He believed we could live in peace. The irony of it hit Taza like a physical blow. This woman's husband had been killed while trying to help Apache children, while his own family had been murdered by soldiers who saw no difference between warrior and child, man and woman. The cycle of violence had consumed them both, leaving them with nothing but pain and the children they loved. Grace, sensing the tension between the adults, moved closer to Taza and took his large hand in her small ones. "He has sad eyes like you do, Mama. I think maybe his family got hurt too." The simple observation, delivered with a child's intuitive understanding, seemed to deflate some of Sarah's anger. She looked more carefully at Taza's face, seeing perhaps for the first time the grief that lived there alongside the strength. "You," she started, then stopped, afraid to ask the question whose answer might change everything. "Lose my family to your people?" Taza finished gently. "Yes. My wife and children were killed by cavalry soldiers 2 years ago." They were gathering food for the winter, far from any battle, but that did not matter to the men who found them. Sarah's breathing grew shallow as the full weight of their situation settled over her. They were both victims of the same endless war, both carrying wounds that might never heal. But they were also representatives of the forces that had destroyed each other's lives. "Grace," she said carefully, never taking her eyes off Taza, "come here to me." "No, Mama, you're being mean." "To him, and he saved your life." Grace's voice carried a fierce loyalty that surprised them both. He could have just walked away, but he didn't. He stayed and took care of us, and he was gentle, and he sang healing songs, and he shared his food even though he doesn't have very much. "You sang to her?" Sarah asked, something in her expression softening slightly. "Healing songs," Taza confirmed. "They help the medicine work, and they comfort the spirits of the sick. Your daughter was very frightened." Sarah looked down at her bandaged wound, then at the evidence of careful nursing that surrounded her. The clean water, the properly applied dressings, the small pile of medicinal herbs arranged with obvious knowledge and care. Whatever else this man might be, he was clearly a healer, and he had used his skills to save her life when he could easily have let her die. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help us?" Taza was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one was a stone he was placing carefully in the foundation of something new. "Because your daughter asked me to. Because she cried for her mother the way my daughter used to cry when she had bad dreams. Because in her tears, I heard something I thought was lost forever." "What?" "The sound of innocence asking for mercy." Sarah closed her eyes, and when she opened them, some fundamental shift had occurred. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now by reluctant gratitude and the beginning of something that might eventually become understanding. "What happens now?" she asked. "I'm not strong enough to travel, and Grace, she can't survive out here alone if something happens to me." "You will stay until you are strong," Taza said simply. "Then you will decide where to go and what to do. I will not leave you to die, but I cannot stay long. My presence here puts you in danger." "Danger from who?" "From soldiers who do not ask questions before they shoot Apache. From settlers who would assume I had taken you captive. From my own people who might see me as a traitor for helping the enemy." He stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long night of sitting watch. "But most of all, from myself. Because the longer I stay, the more I will care what happens to you and your daughter. And caring for you feels like betraying the memory of those I have already lost." Grace looked up at him with eyes full of wisdom beyond her years. "My papa used to say that love doesn't run out. There's always more if you're brave enough to find it." The words hung in the desert air like a prayer, challenging everything Taza thought he knew about grief, loyalty, and the limits of the human heart. In the distance, a dust cloud on the horizon suggested that their time for quiet reflection was running short. Someone was coming, and in this territory, visitors rarely brought good news. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as the morning wore on, and with it came the sound that made every Apache's blood run cold, the rhythmic thunder of cavalry horses moving at a steady trot. Taza counted at least 6 riders, maybe more, following the rough trail that led past the abandoned homestead. They would arrive within the hour. "We need to move you inside," Taza told Sarah, his voice calm but urgent. "Can you walk?" Sarah struggled to sit up fully, her face pale with effort. "I think so. Grace, help me." But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled, and she would have fallen if Taza hadn't caught her. The infection had taken more out of her than pride wanted to admit, and her body was nowhere near ready for the demands of hiding or fleeing. "I can't," she whispered, frustrated tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm too weak." "They'll find us, and Grace, what will they think when they see you with us?" "They will think what soldiers always think," Taza replied grimly. that I am the enemy, and you are my prisoners." Grace, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly straightened with the fierce determination that was becoming her trademark. "Then we'll tell them the truth. We'll tell them you saved Mama's life." "Little one," Taza said gently, kneeling to her level, "the truth is often not what people want to hear, especially when they have already decided what story they prefer." Despite the approaching danger, he found himself taking the time to explain rather than simply giving orders. There was something about Grace's earnest faith in fairness that demanded honest answers, even when honesty was painful. As they worked together to help Sarah into the dubious shelter of the ruined homestead, Taza made a decision that surprised even him. He reached into his pack and pulled out his most precious possession, a blanket woven by his wife Ayana in the months before their first child was born. It was made from the finest wool they could afford, dyed with colors that spoke of sky and earth and growing things. He had carried it with him for 2 years, unable to use it because it smelled faintly of her, of home, of everything he had lost. "Here," he said, wrapping it around Sarah's shoulders as she settled against the adobe. "Well, this will keep you warm." Sarah fingered the soft wool, recognizing the quality of the weaving even in her weakened state. "This is beautiful. It must be very precious to you." "It was my wife's," Taza admitted, the words coming harder than he expected. "She made it before our first child was born. She said it would keep our family warm, no matter how cold the world became." Grace reached out to touch the blanket's intricate patterns with reverent fingers. "She must have loved you very much to make something so pretty." "Yes, she did." The sound of horses grew closer, and Taza quickly began gathering evidence of his presence: the medicine pouch, the healing herbs, anything that would immediately identify him as Apache. But Grace caught his arm with surprising strength. "Don't hide," she said fiercely. "You didn't do anything wrong. You helped us." "Grace is right," Sarah said slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "If they find you hiding, it will look worse. If they find you caring for the sick." She paused, working through the implications. "Tell me, do you have children in the reservation schools?" Taza shook his head. "My children never lived to see the schools. But other Apache children do. Children who might need medicine, who might need healing that the army doctors don't understand." Understanding dawned in Taza's eyes. "You would tell them I am a medicine man? That I was here treating sickness? It's not a lie," Sarah said firmly. "That's exactly what you are, and exactly what you did." Before Taza could respond, the sound of horses stopping outside made all conversation unnecessary. Boots hit the ground, and voices carried on the desert. Ere the clipped, efficient tones of military men conducting a search. "Hello, the house," called a voice with the authority of command. "This is Lieutenant Brooks of the 3rd Cavalry. Is anyone inside?" Sarah took a deep breath, gathering what strength she had. "Here, we're here. Please help us." The sound of her voice, clearly that of a white woman in distress, brought immediate response. Footsteps approached quickly, and soon the broken doorway was filled with the blue uniform and concerned face of a young cavalry officer. His eyes took in the scene: the obviously ill woman wrapped in an Indian blanket, the small girl who clung protectively to her mother, and the Apache man who sat calmly nearby, making no attempt to hide or flee. "Ma'am, are you all right? Has this man hurt you in any way?" "Quite the opposite, Lieutenant," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "This man saved my life. I was dying of infection, and he treated me with medicines I've never seen before. My daughter and I owe him our lives." The lieutenant's hand had moved instinctively to his sidearm when he saw Taza, but Sarah's words made him pause. Behind him, several enlisted men crowded the doorway, their expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. These were men who had seen Apache raids, who had lost friends to the endless border war. The idea that one of their enemies might be playing healer rather than warrior clearly didn't sit well with them. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said carefully, "sometimes Indians will appear to help, but they have other motives. Has he asked for anything in return? Has he made any demands?" Grace spoke up before her mother could answer. "He gave us his blanket and his food and his water, and he sat up all night making sure Mama was breathing right. He sang songs to make the medicine work better, and he told me about plants that can help sick people, and he never asked for anything except—" She paused, thinking. "Except he asked if we had any people who loved us and would be worried." This unexpected testimony from a child clearly caught the soldiers off guard. Children, in their experience, didn't lie about such things, especially not to protect Indians. "What's your name, little miss?" the lieutenant asked kindly. "Grace Miller. This is my mama, Sarah Miller. Our papa was killed 3 weeks ago near Tucson." Her voice wavered slightly on this last part, but she pressed on. "Taza, that's his name. Taza lost his family, too. They understand each other about being sad." The lieutenant's expression grew more complicated. Here was a scenario that didn't fit the simple categories of his military training. An Apache warrior tending white settlers, a sick woman defending her Indian rescuer, a child who seemed to see no contradiction in trusting someone she should fear. "Taza, is it?" The lieutenant addressed him directly for the first time. "You speak English?" "Yes," Taza replied simply. "Why are you here? Why aren't you on the reservation?" Taza met his gaze steadily. "I go where the spirits lead me. Yesterday, they led me to a child crying for her mother's life." The answer was honest without being complete, respectful without being submissive. It told enough truth to satisfy honor while revealing nothing that could be used against him later. Lieutenant Brooks studied the scene more carefully, taking in details he had missed in his initial concern for the settler's safety. The woman was clearly recovering from serious illness, but her color was good and her breathing steady. The child showed no signs of trauma or fear. The Apache's medicine pouch lay open beside carefully arranged healing herbs, and the smell of medicinal plants filled the small space. "Sergeant," he called to one of his men, "what do you make of this?" The grizzled non-com stepped forward, his experienced eyes taking in details the younger officer had missed. "Well, sir, if he meant them harm, he's had plenty of time to do it. And that's real medicine work, not some kind of show. My grandmother used to doctor with plants like that back in Missouri." The moment stretched taut as the lieutenant weighed his options. In the end, it was Grace who tipped the balance, walking over to Taza and taking his hand with complete trust. "He's a good man," she said simply, "just like Papa was." Lieutenant Brooks made his decision with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that the wrong choice could end careers or lives. He holstered his weapon completely and stepped further into the ruined homestead, his posture shifting from suspicious to professionally courteous. "Mrs. Miller, with your permission, I'd like my medical orderly to examine you. We need to be sure you're well enough to travel." "Travel where?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Fort Apache, ma'am. It's the closest army post, and you'll be safe there while we arrange passage back to civilization." Grace's grip on Taza's hand tightened. Even at 8 years old, she understood that safety often meant separation, and separation meant losing the man who had become her protector and teacher in the space of one night. "What about Taza?" she asked, her young voice carrying more authority than most adults managed. "He comes with us, right?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken complications. Lieutenant Brooks glanced at his sergeant, who shrugged slightly, a gesture that conveyed volumes about the complexity of frontier justice and military regulations. "Miss Grace," the lieutenant said gently, "Taza will be fine. His people will take care of him." "His people?" Grace's voice rose with indignation. We're his people now. He's taken care of us, and we're taking care of him. That's what families do. Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding of how much had changed in the few hours since she'd regained consciousness. Her daughter had not simply accepted help from a stranger. She had formed a bond that transcended every social barrier the adult world could construct. "Lieutenant," Sarah said carefully, "might I ask where you're taking us from here? Is there somewhere Grace and I could recover properly before making any major decisions?" "Well, ma'am, there's the Henderson place about 10 miles east. They've got a proper house, and Mrs. Henderson has some medical training. Or Fort Apache, like I said. And if we chose to remain here for a few more days, to let me regain my strength." The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I wouldn't recommend that. This area isn't safe for civilians, especially not for a woman and child alone." "But we wouldn't be alone," Grace piped up. "Taza would stay with us." "Miss Grace," the sergeant said, his weathered face kind but firm, "Apache belong on reservations. It's the law." Grace looked at the sergeant with the devastating directness that only children possess. Whose law? The question hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that none of the adults were quite ready to address. In the awkward silence that followed, Taza spoke for the first time since the soldiers had arrived. "The child speaks truth," he said quietly, "but she is young and does not understand how the world works. I will go where I am supposed to go, and you will take Mrs. Miller and Grace to safety. This is the way things must be." "No!" Grace's voice cracked with the beginning of tears. "That's not fair. You saved Mama's life, and now they want to take you away like you did something wrong." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a mother's instinct to protect, but expanded now to include the man who had shown such kindness to her family. "Lieutenant Brooks, what exactly are the regulations regarding Apache who are found off the reservation?" "Well, ma'am, technically they're supposed to be returned to the reservation. But in cases where there are mitigating circumstances, there's some discretion involved." "And what would constitute mitigating circumstances?" The lieutenant exchanged another look with his sergeant. Both men had seen enough of frontier life to know that regulations and reality didn't always align neatly. "Ma'am, if an Apache was, say, serving as a translator or guide for the Army, or providing medical services to settlers, there might be provisions for special status." Sarah felt a spark of hope. Medical services. Like treating a dying woman with traditional Apache medicine. "Possibly, ma'am." Grace, following this conversation with the intense focus of a child whose world depended on the outcome, suddenly brightened with an idea. She disappeared into the corner where their few possessions were stacked and returned with something that made everyone in the room take notice. It was a cornhusk doll, simple but carefully made, with a dress fashioned from scraps of calico and hair braided from corn silk. The doll was clearly precious to Grace, worn smooth from handling, mended in several places with tiny, careful stitches. "This is Anna," Grace announced, holding the doll up for everyone to see. "My mama made her for me before Papa died. She's been my friend when I was scared." She turned to Taza with solemn ceremony. "I want you to have her, to remember us." The gift was so unexpected, so generous, that it left the adult speechless. Taza looked down at the small offering, understanding instinctively that he was being handed not just a toy, but a piece of this child's heart. "Grace," he said gently, "this is too precious. You should keep Anna with you." "No," Grace said firmly. "Anna helps people when they're lonely and scared. You're going to be lonely without us, so she should go with you. Besides," she added with the practical wisdom of childhood, "if you have her, then part of us will always be with you, and part of you will always be with us." Sarah watched this exchange with tears gathering in her eyes. A daughter was giving away her most treasured possession to a man she had known for less than 24 hours. and somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Taza," Sarah said softly, "would you accept Grace's gift?" It would mean a great deal to her. Taza took the doll with hands that trembled slightly, cradling it as if it were made of spun glass. In his weathered fingers, the simple toy looked both fragile and infinitely precious. "I am honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Anna will be safe with me, and she will help me remember that kindness still exists in the world." "Lieutenant." Brooks cleared his throat, clearly moved by the scene, but mindful of his duties. "Mrs. Miller, we really do need to make some decisions about your immediate safety." Sarah looked around the ruined homestead, at the Apache blanket that had kept her warm, at her daughter's face shining with trust and love, at the man who had shown them mercy when he had every reason to walk away. "Lieutenant, what if I told you that I'm considering staying in this area? That I might want a homestead here, properly this time?" "Ma'am, I'd have to advise against it. This is dangerous country. But if I insisted? If I said that I needed time to recover, and that I wanted Mr. Taza to serve as my guide and medical advisor during that recovery?" The lieutenant was quiet for a long moment, working through the implications. "Ma'am, are you saying you'd want to employ this Apache in an official capacity?" "I'm saying that he saved my life, and I trust his knowledge of this land and its healing properties. If I'm going to survive out here, I need someone who understands the desert." Grace clapped her hands together, understanding that her mother was fighting for their new family in the only way the adult world would accept. "There would be paperwork," the lieutenant said slowly. "Official documentation. And he'd have to check in regularly with the Army, probably at Fort Apache." "That seems reasonable," Sarah agreed. Taza had listened to this entire exchange with growing amazement. These people, these strangers who should have been his enemies, were risking their own safety and reputation to protect him. The feeling was so foreign after 2 years of isolation that he hardly knew how to respond. "Mrs. Miller," he said carefully, "you do not understand what you are offering. To associate with Apache, to trust Apache, this will make other whites suspicious of you. It will make your life harder." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Taza, my husband died trying to help Apache children because he believed in doing what was right rather than what was easy. I think he'd approve of his wife and daughter following his example. Besides," Grace added, hugging the warm blanket around her shoulders, "we're a family now. Families stick together." The word family hung in the air like a benediction, transforming everything it touched. Lieutenant Brooks looked at his sergeant, who nodded slightly. "All right, Mrs. Miller, I'll draw up the temporary papers. But this arrangement will need to be reviewed by the post commander, and there will be conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "Regular check-ins, like I said. No traveling more than a day's ride from Fort Apache without Army escort. And," he paused, looking directly at Taza, "no contact with hostile Apache bands. Any intelligence about raiding parties or unrest gets reported immediately." Taza nodded gravely. "I understand." As the soldiers prepared to leave, having decided that the situation was unusual but not dangerous, Grace tugged on Taza's sleeve. "Will you teach me more about the healing plants?" she asked. "And maybe some Apache words? If your mother permits it." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile since her husband's death. "I think that would be wonderful. It seems we have a lot to learn about our new home." After the cavalry patrol disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert afternoon, the three of them sat in the shade of the broken homestead, each lost in thought about how drastically their lives had changed. The cornhusk doll sat carefully propped against Taza's pack, a small guardian watching over their unlikely family. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now," Taza said, settling back against the adobe wall, "we learn to live with the choices we have made." "Are they good choices?" Grace answered before he could. "They're brave choices. Papa always said that was more important than good or bad. As the sun moved across the sky, painting the desert in ever-changing shades of gold and red, they began the slow work of building something that had never existed before, a bridge between worlds, held together by nothing more substantial than mercy, trust, and the faith of a child who believed that love was stronger than fear. 3 weeks had passed since Lieutenant Brooks and his patrol had ridden away, leaving behind official papers that granted Taza temporary status as a civilian contractor and medical advisor. The abandoned homestead had been transformed from a place of desperation into something approaching a home, though it remained rough and precarious. Sarah's strength had returned steadily under Taza's care, and she had thrown herself into the work of making their shelter more livable. The partially collapsed roof had been repaired with branches and adobe, the broken door rehung with new leather hinges, and a proper fire pit constructed outside for cooking. She had even managed to create a small garden patch, coaxing vegetables from seeds they had bartered from a passing trader. But it was Grace who had truly flourished in their new arrangement. The child had attached herself to Taza with the devotion of a shadow, following him on his daily rounds to gather medicinal plants, learning to identify herbs by their leaves and flowers, absorbing Apache words and phrases with the effortless facility of the young. Her cornhusk doe Anna had taken permanent residence in Taza's pack, a constant reminder of the trust that had been placed in him. On this particular morning, Taza worked at his latest project, a wooden horse carved from a piece of juniper that had fallen in a recent storm. His hands moved with practiced skill, the knife following paths taught to him by his own father decades ago. The horse was taking shape slowly, its legs strong and straight, its head held high with the pride of a creature born to run free. "What are you making?" Grace asked, settling beside him in the shade of the repaired ramada. "A horse for a young warrior," Taza replied, not looking up from his work. "My father carved one like this for me when I was about your age. He said every Apache child should have a horse to carry their dreams." Grace watched the delicate work with fascination. "Will you teach me how to carve?" "If your mother says it is permitted, she will. She likes it when you teach me things." Grace paused, considering. "Taza, do you miss your real children?" The question was asked with the casual directness that children possessed, but it hit Taza with unexpected force. He set down his knife and looked at this little girl who had somehow carved her own place in his heart. "Every day," he said honestly. "But missing them does not mean I cannot care for you." "Good, because I was worried that maybe you still felt too sad to love us properly." The simple statement, delivered without self-consciousness, made Taza understand something that had been troubling him for weeks. He had been feeling guilty about the happiness that Grace and Sarah brought him, as if caring for them somehow dishonored the memory of his murdered family. "Grace," he said carefully, "do you think your father would be angry if your mother learned to care for someone new?" Grace considered this with the gravity she brought to all important questions. "I don't think so. Papa always said that love wasn't like food sharing. It didn't mean there was less of it. He said love was more like a fire. The more you shared it, the brighter it got." From inside the homestead came the sound of Sarah humming as she worked, unmending their clothes, a domestic melody that spoke of contentment despite their uncertain circumstances. The sound made both Taza and Grace smile. "Your mother has become strong again," Taza observed. "She likes having work to do, and she likes having someone to take care of who takes care of us back." Grace leaned against his shoulder with the casual affection that had become natural between them. "She talks to you different than she talked to other grown-ups back in town." "Different how?" "Like she's not scared you'll think she's stupid. Like she knows you'll listen to the important parts." Taza resumed his carving, thinking about the conversations he and Sarah had been sharing in the evenings after Grace fell asleep. They talked about practical things, water sources, winter preparations, The Army's changing policies toward Apache, but underneath the practical topics ran deeper currents. Sarah spoke of her dreams for Grace's future, of her late husband's belief in the possibility of peace, of her own growing understanding that the world was more complicated than the newspaper stories had suggested, and he found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, memories of his children's laughter, his wife's wisdom, the old ways of his people that were disappearing like smoke in the wind. Sarah listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was trying to understand rather than simply being polite. "There," he said, holding up the carved horse for Grace's inspection. "What do you think?" Grace took the toy, with reverent hands, turning it to catch the light. The horse was beautiful in its simplicity, every line clean and purposeful, the wood smooth as silk from Taza's patient work. "It's perfect," she breathed. "But Taza, I'm not a warrior. I'm just a girl." "Warriors come in many forms," Taza replied seriously. "Some carry weapons, some carry wisdom, some carry hope. You, Grace Miller, carry the kind of courage that builds bridges between worlds. That makes you a warrior of the most important kind." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel made from an old flour sack. She had adapted to frontier life with remarkable resilience, learning to make do with whatever materials they could find or trade for. "What are you two conspirators discussing?" she asked, settling beside them with the easy comfort that had developed between the three of them. "Taza made me a horse." Grace held up the carving proudly. "He says it's for carrying dreams." Sarah examined the toy with appreciation for both its craftsmanship and its significance. "It's beautiful. Your father was very skilled. All Apache children learn to work with wood and leather," Taza explained. "These skills kept us alive when other things failed." "I'd like to learn too," Sarah said quietly. "Not just for practical reasons, but I want to understand the things that matter to you, both of you." The statement carried weight beyond its simple words. Sarah was not just expressing interest in handicrafts, she was asking to be included in the cultural traditions that shaped Taza's world, to become part of something larger than their immediate circumstances. "Winter will be here soon," Taza said thoughtfully. "It would be good to have projects for the long evenings." "And stories," Grace added. "You promised to tell me about the creation of the first horses." "And Sarah could share the stories from her people," Taza suggested. "It is good for children to know many stories." As the afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, they sat together in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of the future they were building together. The wooden horse rested in Grace's lap, a symbol of dreams that could still take flight despite the harsh realities of their world dot in the distance. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, a reminder that winter was indeed approaching, and with it would come challenges that would test the strength of the bonds they had formed. But for now, in this moment of peace, they were simply a family sharing the quiet satisfaction of work completed and love freely given. The first snow came early that year, dusting the desert in a thin veil of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. Grace had never seen snow in the desert before, and she pressed her face against the single glass window that Taza had managed to install in the homestead, watching the flakes dance in the pale morning light. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Like the world is getting ready for Christmas." Sarah looked up from where she sat mending clothes by the fire, her fingers stiff from the cold despite the warmth. Christmas. I had almost forgotten what month it was. The mention of the holiday brought a moment of awkward silence. Christmas was a celebration tied to specific traditions, specific beliefs, and none of them were quite sure how to navigate the religious and cultural differences that suddenly seemed more pronounced in the intimate space of their shared home. It was Taza who broke the silence, speaking from where he worked on repairing their water barrel. "What is Christmas like in your tradition?" Sarah set down her mending, grateful for the question. "It's a celebration of birth, of hope coming into a dark world. Families gather, share meals, exchange gifts, tell stories about love overcoming fear." "That sounds much like our winter ceremonies," Taza said thoughtfully. "We too celebrate light in the darkness and the bonds that hold families together through the cold months." Grace turned from the window, her eyes bright with excitement. "Could we have both, Christmas and Apache winter ceremonies?" "Grace," Sarah said gently, "I'm not sure that's why not." The child interrupted with the logic that only 8-year-olds possessed. "God made all people, right? So maybe God likes all kinds of celebrations." Sarah found herself looking at Taza, seeking his thoughts on her daughter's theological reasoning. What she saw in his eyes was not offense or confusion, but a kind of gentle amusement and something deeper acceptance. "In Apache belief," he said carefully, "the Great Spirit speaks to all people, but in different languages. Perhaps your daughter is wise to think that celebrations of love and hope please the spirits, whatever names we call them." This conversation led them to a project that occupied much of the dark December evenings. Sarah had brought her mother's Bible with her from their previous life, a worn leather volume that contained not just scripture but family history, pressed flowers from her wedding day, a lock of her father's hair, Grace's first attempt at writing her name. Now she began reading aloud in the evenings, sharing stories of wandering peoples and promised lands, of families torn apart and reunited, of faith tested and renewed. Taza listened with the attention of someone who understood that all stories carried wisdom, regardless of their source. In return, he shared the oral traditions of his people creation stories that explained how mountains were formed and rivers carved their paths, tales of clever coyotes and wise grandmothers, legends of heroes who sacrificed everything to protect their families. Grace absorbed these stories like desert earth absorbing rain, asking questions that showed she understood the deeper meanings beneath the surface narratives. "In your stories and ours," Taza observed one evening as wind howled around their shelter, "the heroes are always the ones who choose love over fear, who protect the helpless, who keep faith when the world seems dark." "Yes," Sarah agreed, closing the Bible and setting it carefully on the wooden box that served as their table. "I think that's what my husband was trying to do, be a hero in a small way. He believed that if enough people chose kindness over hatred, the world could change." Grace looked up from where she was playing with her wooden horse, making it gallop across the rough floor. "Maybe that's what we're doing too. Being heroes by choosing to be a family, even when other people think we shouldn't." The wisdom of this observation struck both adults with surprising force. They were being heroic, in their quiet way, choosing to trust across racial lines, choosing to build something beautiful in the midst of a world torn by violence and prejudice. As winter deepened, their evening conversations ranged across topics that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives. Sarah spoke of her dreams for Grace's education, her hopes that her daughter might grow up in a world with less hatred. Taza shared his knowledge of the desert's hidden places, the seasonal rhythms that governed Apache life, the ceremonies that marked the passage of time. They discovered unexpected common ground in their values, the importance of honesty, the duty to care for the vulnerable, the belief that strength came not from weapons, but from the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. "I want to ask you something," Sarah said one night when Grace had fallen asleep curled between them, her wooden horse clutched in her small fist. "But I'm afraid it might offend you." "Ask," Taza said simply. "When you look at us," said Grace, "and me, do you see the people who killed your family? Do you ever feel angry that you're protecting the children of your enemies?" Taza was quiet for so long that Sarah began to regret the question. But when he finally spoke, His words came with the weight of careful consideration. At first, yes. When I saw you unconscious in the dirt, part of me wanted to walk away and let the desert have you. You represented everything I had lost. Everything. I hated. He paused, watching the firelight play across Grace's sleeping face. But then your daughter cried for help, and I heard in her voice the same love I had heard in my own children's voices. Love is the same in all languages, Sarah. Pain is the same. Hope is the same. And now? Now when I look at you, I see my daughter's courage in Grace's eyes. I see my wife's strength in your determination to survive. I see my son's curiosity in Grace's endless questions. He reached over to adjust the blanket around the sleeping child. I do not see enemies. I see the family that the spirits gave me to replace the one that was taken. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. Taza, you do not need to say anything. We both know that this cannot last forever. The world outside will not let us remain hidden here indefinitely. But for now, for this winter, we have each other. That is enough. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside their small shelter, warmth and love created a sanctuary that felt as secure as any fortress. They had built more than just physical repairs to a broken homestead. They had built a home where 3 wounded souls could heal together, where different traditions could merge into something new and beautiful, where the future seemed possible. Despite the darkness of the past dot as the fire burned low and they settled into sleep, none of them could have predicted that their peaceful winter idyll was about to be shattered by a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about the past and force them to confront a future more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The discovery came by accident, as life-changing revelations often do. Grace was playing in the corner of the homestead where they kept their few possessions, constructing an elaborate scenario with her wooden horse and cornhusk doll when she knocked over the leather satchel that had belonged to her father. The contents spilled across the dirt floor, a few tools, some spare clothing, and a packet of letters bound with a frayed ribbon. "Mama, what are these?" Grace called, holding up the packet with curiosity. Sarah looked over from where she was, grinding corn for their evening meal, and her face went pale. I thought those were lost in the attack." "Where did you find them?" "They were in Papa's bag, way down at the bottom." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to where Grace sat surrounded by the scattered belongings. With trembling fingers, she took the packet of letters, recognizing her husband's careful handwriting on the outside envelope. The paper was water-stained and worn, but the words were still legible. "For Sarah to be opened only if something happens to me." Taza looked up from where he was preparing medicine for a trader who had stopped by earlier complaining of stomach ailments. "What is it?" "Letters from Thomas," Sarah whispered. "He left them for me, but I never found them after he died." Her voice broke slightly on the words. "Should we read them?" Grace asked with the practical curiosity of childhood. Sarah's hand shook as she untied the ribbon. Inside the outer envelope were several folded pages covered in her husband's familiar script, along with what appeared to be official documents and a smaller sealed envelope marked Evidence. "My dearest Sarah," she began reading aloud, her voice growing stronger as she found comfort in her husband's words. "If you are reading this, then my fears about Captain Morrison and his men have proven justified, and I am no longer able to protect you and Grace myself." Taza set down his medicine work and moved closer, sensing the importance of what was being revealed. Sarah continued reading. "I have discovered something terrible, something that explains why the Apache raids near Tucson have been so brutal. Why peaceful Apache families have been found murdered in ways that make no sense tactically. Sarah, I don't think the Apache are responsible for many of the atrocities being blamed on them." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that none of them fully grasped yet. "Captain Morrison has been leading what he calls false flag. Operations dressing his men as Apache warriors and attacking both settler and Apache families, then reporting the incidents as Indian raids. The goal is to inflame public opinion and justify more aggressive military action against all Apache peoples, regardless of whether they've honored the peace treaties. Grace looked confused. What does that mean? Taza's face had gone very still, the kind of stillness that came before storms. It means that white soldiers dressed like Apache and killed innocent people, then blamed my people for the murders. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper as she continued. I have been documenting these atrocities, gathering evidence, preparing to report Morrison and his co-conspirators to the territorial governor and the newspapers back east. But Morrison suspects my loyalty, and I fear for my safety and yours. The next paragraph made Sarah gasp audibly. If something happens to me, know that it will not be Apache hands that kill me. Morrison cannot allow me to expose his crimes. The evidence is all here. Photographs, witness statements, Morrison's own orders written in his hand. Sarah, you must get this information to honest authorities. The Apache people have suffered enough for crimes they did not commit. Taza was very quiet, processing the implications. If Thomas Miller had been documenting army atrocities against Apache families, if he had proof that soldiers were committing murders and blaming them on Apache, then he might have evidence related to the deaths of Taza's own wife and children. There's more, Sarah said, opening the envelope marked evidence. Inside were several items that made her heart race. Official Army documents bearing Captain Morrison's signature, a photograph showing soldiers in Apache clothing beside the bodies of a murdered family, and a list of dates and locations that corresponded to reported Apache raids. But it was the final item that made Taza's breath catch in his throat. It was a detailed report in Thomas Miller's handwriting, describing an attack on an Apache family gathering pinon nuts near Fort Apache. The date was exactly 2 years ago. The location matched perfectly with where Taza's family had been killed. Apache family of 3 men away hunting, woman and 2 children gathering winter food. Sarah read with growing horror. Morrison's patrol arrived at dawn, killed all 3 victims, scattered Apache artifacts around the scene to suggest tribal warfare. Bodies mutilated post-mortem to appear consistent with Apache revenge killings. Reported as raid by hostile Apache on peaceful Apache families loyal to the reservation. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace looked from her mother to Taza, sensing the terrible weight of what had been revealed, but not fully understanding it. Taza, Sarah whispered, your family, were they killed near Fort Apache 2 years ago while gathering pinon nuts? He nodded, unable to speak. Then they weren't killed by Apache at all. They were murdered by Captain Morrison and his men. The revelation hit like a physical blow. For 2 years, Taza had lived with the guilt and confusion of his family's death killed. Not in battle, not in raid or revenge, but apparently by their own people for reasons he couldn't understand. Now the truth was even more devastating. They had been murdered by white soldiers who then blamed Apache for the crime. There's a letter here, addressed to the territorial governor, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. And copies of correspondence with newspaper editors back east. Thomas was building a case to expose the whole conspiracy. Grace, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of adult complexity, asked the crucial question. If Papa had all this proof, why didn't he give it to the good soldiers before the bad soldiers hurt him? Sarah found her answer in the final letter. Morrison discovered my investigation 3 days ago. He has threatened not only me but you and Grace if I proceed with my reports. I am taking the evidence with me on the supply run to Tucson, hoping to find honest Army officers there who will act on this information. If I do not return, you will know why, and you will know that the Apache people are not our enemy's men like Morrison are. The full scope of the tragedy was now clear. Thomas Miller had been murdered not by Apache seeking revenge, but by the very soldiers he was trying to expose. Sarah and Grace had been told their husband and father died in an Apache raid, when in reality he had been killed for trying to protect Apache families from military atrocities. "We have to do something," Sarah said, her voice firm with newfound purpose. "This evidence, it could save lives. It could stop Morrison from killing more innocent people. It could also get us all killed." Taza pointed out grimly, "Morrison and his men are still out there. If they killed your husband to protect their secret, they will certainly kill us." Grace, still holding her wooden horse, looked up at the two adults who had become her world. "But we can't let the bad men keep hurting people, right? That's not what heroes do." The simple moral clarity of her statement cut through all their fears and complications. They had evidence of massive injustice, evidence that could save lives and restore honor to Taza's murdered family. The question was no longer whether they should act, but whether they had the courage to see it through dawn as night fell over their desert sanctuary. They huddled around the fire reading and rereading the documents that had transformed their understanding of everything. The peaceful winter they had been building was over. Now they faced a choice that would either vindicate the innocent dead or add their own names to Morrison's list of necessary casualties. Outside, storm clouds gathered with unusual speed, as if the desert itself sensed that great changes were coming. The evidence of Captain Morrison's crimes lay spread before them in the firelight, each document a testament to the depths of human evil and the courage required to confront it. Their quiet sanctuary had become ground zero for a battle that would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of countless innocent lives caught between military ambition and frontier justice. The discovery of Thomas Miller's hidden letters had changed everything, and there was no going back. The morning after their discovery dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds massing on the horizon like an army preparing for battle. None of them had slept well, their minds churning with the implications of Thomas Miller's hidden evidence and the terrible choice that now lay before them. Taza sat outside the homestead in the pre-dawn darkness, applying war paint with steady hands, the first time he had done so since his family's death. The sacred pigments had been mixed from clay and mineral ochre, blessed according to the old traditions, but this time they carried a different meaning. This was not paint for war against enemies, the paint for protecting his chosen family against those who would destroy them for speaking the truth. The red stripe across his forehead honored the blood of innocents, his murdered wife and children. Thomas Miller, all the Apache families killed by Morrison's deception. The black marks beneath his eyes represented his willingness to walk into darkness to protect those he loved. The white symbols on his cheeks spoke of purification, of cleansing old wounds through righteous action. Sarah emerged from the homestead, carrying their few precious possessions packed into traveling bundles. She had spent the dark hours before dawn writing out copies of the most crucial evidence, hiding the originals in different locations, according to a plan they had developed through the long night. "The storm will be here soon," she observed, watching Taza complete his ritual preparations. "Yes, it will provide cover for what we must do." They had decided to take the evidence to Fort Bowie, 3 days' ride to the north, where Sarah's husband had mentioned an honest commanding officer named Colonel Harrison. It was a dangerous journey that would take them through territory controlled by Morrison's patrols, but staying at the homestead was no longer an option. If Morrison suspected that Thomas Miller's evidence still existed, he would eventually come. Looking for a Grace appeared in the doorway, her small face serious with the gravity of their situation. In her arms, she carried her wooden horse and the cornhusk doll that had traveled back to her from Taza's pack. "I want to help," she announced with the determination that had become her signature. "Little one," Taza said gently, "what we must do now is very dangerous. The best way you can help is by staying close to your mother and doing exactly what we tell you. I know, but I want to do something important too. Grace held up the cornhusk doll. Anna has been taking care of you, and now she needs to take care of something else. She walked over to where they had hidden one set of the copied documents and carefully tucked the papers inside the doll's dress. If something happens to us, someone will find Anna and know what the bad soldiers did. The simple brilliance of the plan struck both adults immediately. A child's toy would be overlooked by searchers, dismissed as worthless, but it could carry the most important evidence of their lives. Grace Miller, Taza said solemnly, "You are indeed a warrior." As they made final preparations for their departure, each of them understood that they were leaving behind more than just a physical shelter. The homestead had become the first place in years where any of them had felt truly safe, truly at home. Now they were venturing back into a world that viewed their family as an impossibility, their bond as a betrayal of natural order. Sarah checked the rifle Thomas had left her, making sure it was loaded and ready. She had never considered herself capable of violence, but the evidence of Morrison's crimes had awakened something fierce and protective in her heart. These men had murdered her husband for trying to do the right thing. They had killed Taza's innocent family to advance their own twisted agenda. They would not hesitate to kill Grace if it served their purposes. "Sarah," Taza said as they prepared to set out, "once we leave this place, there may be no turning back. If we are caught with this evidence, Morrison will kill us all and claim we were spies or conspirators. Are you certain this is what you want to do?" Sarah looked at her daughter, who stood ready for their journey with the quiet courage that had sustained them all. She thought of her husband's final words about choosing kindness over hatred, about believing that people could change the world through small acts of moral courage. Thomas died trying to stop innocent people from being murdered, she said firmly. If we don't finish what he started, those deaths will mean nothing. Grace deserves to grow up in a world where justice matters more than convenience. They set out into the gray morning, following game trails that would keep them away from the main roads where cavalry patrols might spot them. Taza led them through country he knew intimately, reading the landscape like a book written in stone and sage. Water and wind died by midday. The storm had caught them, not the gentle desert rain that brought life, but a harsh winter storm that turned the air to ice and made every step treacherous. They took shelter in a small cave that Taza knew, huddling together for warmth while the wind howled outside like the voices of the angry dead. "Tell me about Colonel Harrison," Taza said as they waited for the worst of the storm to pass. "Can he be trusted?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Thomas mentioned him in his letters to me. He's apparently a career officer who came west after the Civil War, believes in following the law rather than making his own. He's also supposedly one of the few commanders who actually reads the reports from his field officers instead of just filing them away. That could work for us or against us," Taza observed. "If he is truly honest, he will act on our evidence. But if he is loyal to the army above all else, he may choose to protect Morrison rather than expose military crimes." Grace, who had been quietly listening to this exchange while playing with her wooden horse, looked up with sudden insight. "Maybe we don't have to make him choose between being loyal and being good. Maybe we can show him that being good is the most loyal thing he can do." Her words carried the kind of wisdom that sometimes emerged from the mouths of children, simple, direct, cutting through adult complications to reach essential truth. As the storm began to subside, they prepared to resume their journey. But before they left the shelter of the cave, Taza performed a ceremony that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. He took Grace's cornhusk doll, now pregnant with evidence that could save or damn them all, and held it up to the four directions, speaking prayers in Apache that asked the spirits to protect innocent children, to guide their steps toward justice, and to give them courage for the trials ahead. Then he placed the doll carefully in Grace's hands. "Anna carries more than papers now," he said solemnly. She carries the hopes of all the innocents who have died for other people's lies. Take care of her. As they emerged from the cave into the cleared but still threatening sky, they could see dust on the southern horizon, riders moving fast, following their trail. Morrison's men had found the homestead sooner than expected and were already in pursuit. How far to Fort Bowie? Sarah asked, trying to keep fear out of her voice. 2 days if we push hard, Taza replied, studying the approaching riders through eyes narrowed against the wind. But they will catch us before then, unless... He stopped, his expression changing as he calculated distances, terrain, and possibilities. Unless... What? Unless we split up. If I lead them away from you and Grace, you might reach the fort safely. No. Sarah's voice was steel. We stay together. We're a family, remember? Families don't abandon each other. Grace nodded firmly, clutching her precious doll. Besides, you know all the secret places to hide. We need you. Looking at their determined faces, Taza felt something shift in his heart. The final transformation. From a man who had lost everything to a man who had everything to fight for. The war paint on his face no longer represented preparation for battle. It represented his commitment to protecting the future that his chosen family could build together. Then we run, he said simply, and we pray that love is stronger than hatred, truth stronger than lies. As they set out across the desert toward an uncertain confrontation with forces that would gladly destroy them, none of them looked back at the cave that had sheltered them. They were no longer people seeking refuge. They were people carrying hope toward a reckoning that would determine whether justice could survive in a world built on violence and deception. The storm clouds were breaking apart, letting through shafts of sunlight that painted the desert in gold and shadow. Behind them, dust plumes marked the approach of their enemies. Ahead lay Fort Bowie and the chance to honor the dead by protecting the living. Grace walked between her mother and Taza, her small hand firmly grasping the doll that carried their hopes and fears. In her other hand, she held the wooden horse that had carried her dreams. Between toy horse and cornhusk doll, between dreams and evidence, between past and future, she carried the bridge that connected two worlds learning to trust each other. The final confrontation was coming, and they would meet it as they had met everything else together. They had traveled through the night, following deer paths and dry washes that would hide their tracks. But the pursuing cavalry had proven more persistent than Taza had hoped. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold, the sound of horses grew steadily closer. Fort Bowie lay just beyond the next ridge, its flag visible in the distance. But between them and Sanctuary rode 6 mounted soldiers in blue uniforms, their weapons gleaming in the early light. At their head was a man whose bearing and silver hair marked him as an officer of considerable rank, Captain Morrison himself, his face set in the hard lines of a man who had come too far to turn back now. Mrs. Miller, Morrison's voice carried across the desert with the authority of command. I know you can hear me. There's no need for anyone to get hurt here. We just want to talk. Sarah, Grace, and Taza had taken shelter behind a cluster of red rocks that offered some protection, but no real hope of escape. The fort was visible, but might as well have been on the moon. There was no way to reach it without crossing open ground where Morrison's men could cut them down with ease. He's lying, Sarah whispered, checking her rifle with hands that trembled only slightly. Men like Morrison don't leave witnesses to their crimes. Taza nodded grimly, studying the approaching soldiers with the tactical eye of a warrior who had survived countless battles. These men had the look of veterans, but they also had the nervous tension of soldiers who knew they were operating outside the bounds of military law. Listen to me carefully, he said quietly to Sarah and Grace. When I give the signal, you run for that arroyo to the north. Follow it toward the fort, and don't look back, no matter what you hear. We're not leaving you, Grace said fiercely, clutching her cornhusk doll against her chest. "Little warrior, this is not about leaving. This is about completing the mission. You carry the evidence that will save innocent lives. That is more important than any one person." Morrison's voice came again, closer now, tinged with impatience. "Mrs. Miller, I knew your husband well. He was a good soldier who got confused about where his loyalties lay. Don't make the same mistake he did." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming what they had already suspected. Thomas had been murdered not by Apache raiders, but by the very soldiers he had trusted and served alongside. "You killed him," she called out, her voice carrying across the rocky landscape with surprising strength. "You killed my husband because he was going to expose your crimes." Morrison's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Your husband was a traitor who was feeding information to Apache hostiles. We have witnesses who will swear to it. Witnesses you paid or threatened," Sarah shot back. "Just like you've been paying men to dress as Apache and murder innocent families." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Morrison had revealed too much, confirmed too much. There would be no negotiation now, no possibility of mercy or compromise. Taza reached slowly for his rifle, a weapon that had served him through 2 decades of warfare. But the most important weapon he carried was not made of steel and wood. It was the blood-stained cavalry gloves that he had taken from Morrison's saddlebags during a raid 6 months ago, proof that the captain had been present at the massacre of Taza's family. "Captain Morrison," Taza called out, his voice carrying the weight of 2 years' grief and rage. "Do you remember a family gathering pandan nuts near Fort Apache? A woman and 2 children who died for your ambition." Morrison's horse shied nervously, responding to its rider's sudden tension. "I don't know what you're talking about, Savage." "I think you do." Taza held up the bloody gloves, and even at a distance, Morrison's recognition was visible in his sudden stillness. "These belong to you. I took them from your horse after you murdered my wife and children." The confrontation had moved beyond questions of evidence or justice. It had become personal, a reckoning between 2 men who had lost everything and chosen different paths in response to their grief. Morrison's mask of military propriety finally slipped, revealing the killer beneath. "Your Apache whore and her whelps died because they were in the way of progress. Just like you're in the way now." The racial slur hung in the air like poison, but it was Grace who responded with the moral clarity that cut through all the adult complications. "You're a bad man," she called out, her young voice steady despite her fear. "And bad men always lose in the end, because good people won't let them win." Morrison's face twisted with rage at being lectured by a child. He raised his rifle toward the rocks where they sheltered, and Taza knew that the time for words had passed. "Now," he whispered urgently to Sarah. "Run now." But even as Sarah grabbed Grace's hand and prepared to sprint for the arroyo, they all knew that Morrison's men had positioned themselves too well. The net was closing, and their chances of reaching Fort Bowie alive were growing smaller with each passing second. The final battle was about to begin, and the stakes were nothing less than the truth about innocence and guilt, about justice and revenge, about whether love was strong enough to triumph over hatred in a world gone mad with violence. The first shot came from Morrison's rifle, the bullet striking the rock inches from Grace's head and sending fragments of stone spinning through the morning air. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pushed Grace toward the arroyo while bringing her own weapon to bear, her first shot taking down one of Morrison's sergeants before he could reload. "The sacred burial ground," Taza called out as he returned fire with deadly accuracy. "Follow the arroyo north. It leads to the old Apache burial ground. We make our stand there." Sarah understood immediately. The burial ground would provide better defensive positions, and its spiritual significance to the Apache might give Taza strength for what was to come. More importantly, It was ancient neutral ground, a place where even enemies had traditionally respected the peace of the dead. They ran through a hail of gunfire. Grace clutched tight against her mother's side, the cornhusk doll with its precious cargo of evidence bouncing against the child's hip. Taza covered their retreat, his rifle speaking with the voice of 2 years, accumulated rage and the desperate love of a man protecting his chosen family. 2 more of Morrison's men fell too. Taza's precisely aimed shots. He had learned marksmanship from his grandfather, who had fought both Mexican and American armies, and his skills had not diminished with age. But Morrison and his remaining soldiers pressed their pursuit with the desperation of men who knew they were fighting for their lives as much as their secrets. The burial ground lay in a natural bowl surrounded by ancient stones and twisted juniper trees. Generations of Apache had been laid to rest here, their spirits watching over the sacred space with the patient vigilance of the dead. As they reached the protective ring of stones, Taza felt the presence of his ancestors, and more immediately, the presence of his murdered wife and children. "Ayana," he whispered to his wife's spirit, "help me protect this family as I could not protect you." Sarah took position behind the largest stone marker, her rifle trained on the approaching soldiers. Grace huddled beside her, no longer the carefree child who had played with wooden horses, but a young survivor who understood that evil sometimes had to be fought with force. Morrison appeared at the edge of the burial ground, his remaining men flanking him with military precision. But something in the ancient atmosphere of the place seemed to affect even them. Their movements became more hesitant, their voices more subdued. "This is holy ground," Taza called out, his voice carrying the authority of spiritual conviction. "You have already defiled your souls with the blood of innocents. Do not compound your crimes by bringing violence to the resting place of the dead." Morrison's response was to raise his rifle and fire, but his shot went wide, whether from nervousness or the spiritual weight of the place, only he knew. The bullet struck one of the ancient stone markers, sending chips of sacred rock flying like tears. That desecration was the final straw. Taza rose from behind his cover with a war cry that seemed to echo from the stones themselves, the voices of generations of Apache warriors joining his call for justice. His first shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning the captain around and sending his rifle flying. The battle that followed was brief but fierce. Sarah proved herself a deadly accurate shot, her determination to protect Grace giving her the steadiness she needed. One of Morrison's corporals fell to her rifle, while Taza eliminated the last sergeant with a shot that would have made his grandfather proud. But it was the final confrontation between Taza and Morrison that would be remembered. The wounded captain had drawn his sidearm and was advancing on Grace, intending to use the child as a human shield. Sarah's rifle was empty, and she was desperately trying to reload when Morrison grabbed Grace around the throat. "Drop your weapons," Morrison gasped, blood streaming from his shoulder wound. "Drop them or the child dies." Grace, however, was no longer the terrified little girl who had cried for her mother 3 months ago. As Morrison's arm tightened around her throat, she bit down hard on his wrist while simultaneously driving her elbow into his wounded shoulder. Morrison's scream of pain and rage echoed across the burial ground as he loosened his grip. Grace broke free and ran toward Taza, but Morrison raised his pistol to shoot her in the back. He never got the chance. Taza's final shot took Morrison's center mass, the impact driving the corrupt officer backward into the ancient stones that marked the graves of Apache ancestors. As Morrison fell, his own weapon discharged harmlessly into the sky. And then there was silence, the deep, profound silence of justice finally served. But Morrison's death was not the end. As his blood soaked into the sacred ground, Taza knelt beside the dying man and held up the blood-stained gloves that had started this final confrontation. "Your crimes are finished," Taza said quietly. "My family can rest in peace, and no more. Innocents will die for your lies." Morrison's eyes met his with the vacant stare of a man whose reckoning had finally arrived. His last words were barely a whisper. "You don't understand. There are others. More like me." This doesn't end with, but death cut off his confession, leaving them with the terrible knowledge that Morrison's conspiracy might be larger than they had imagined. The immediate threat was over, but the evidence they carried was more crucial than ever. As the gun smoke cleared and the ancient spirits settled back into their eternal watch, 3 survivors stood among the graves of the dead, holding in their hands the proof that could prevent countless future atrocities if they could find honest authorities brave enough to act on it. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the sacred burial ground, and the high desert of New Mexico territory had begun to show the first tender green of spring. In a valley sheltered by red rock cliffs and blessed with a year-round stream, a small homestead had taken root, not the desperate shelter of survival, but the deliberate construction of people building a future. Sarah stood in the doorway of their new home, watching as Taza taught Grace the finer points of horse training. The wooden horse he had carved for her had been joined by a real pony, a gentle mare that the local Apache band had gifted to Grace in recognition of her courage during the dark winter months. The child's laughter echoed across the valley as the pony responded to her patient guidance, a sound that had become the most beautiful music in the world to the adults who had fought so hard to preserve it. The evidence they had carried to Fort Bowie had indeed changed everything, though not without cost. Colonel Harrison had proven to be the honest officer they had hoped for, and within weeks of receiving Thomas Miller's documentation, investigations had been launched that reached all the way to Washington. Morrison's conspiracy had been larger than they imagined, a network of corrupt officers and civilian contractors who had been profiting from the endless cycle of violence between settlers and Apache. But justice, they had learned, was a complicated thing in the territories. While several officers had been court-martialed and removed from service, many of the civilian conspirators had simply disappeared into the vastness of the frontier. The newspaper stories back east had created a sensation for a few weeks, but public attention was fickle, and other scandals had quickly taken precedence. What mattered more was the immediate effect on their corner of the world. The false flag operations had ended. Genuine peace talks had begun between local Apache bands and territorial authorities, and families on both sides were no longer living in constant fear of manufactured atrocities. The valley where they had chosen to rebuild their lives sat on the boundary between Apache and settler territory, a place where both peoples came to trade and sometimes, increasingly, to learn from each other. Sarah had established a small school that served children from both communities, teaching reading and writing in English, while Taza shared traditional Apache knowledge of desert survival and herbal medicine. "Mama, look!" Grace called out as her pony stepped through a series of poles Taza had arranged on the ground. "Starlight is learning to dance." Sarah smiled at the name Grace had chosen for her horse, a name that spoke of light piercing darkness, of hope visible even in the deepest night. It seemed fitting for a child who had bridged 2 worlds and emerged stronger for the experience. The most significant change, however, had been formalized just 2 weeks ago in a ceremony that blended Apache and Christian traditions in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Sarah and Taza had been married by a frontier preacher who asked no questions about cultural differences, witnessed by friends from both communities who had come to understand that love recognized no boundaries of race or history. Grace had been the flower girl, carrying a bouquet of desert wildflowers in one hand and her cornhusk doll Anna in the other. The doll had long since been relieved of its burden of evidence, but it remained Grace's most treasured possession, a symbol of the courage and trust that had brought their family together. On the mantel of their new home sat a photograph taken by a traveling photographer who had passed through the valley the week after their wedding. The image showed the three of them standing together in front of their homestead. Taza in his finest Apache clothing, Sarah in a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Grace between them in an outfit that combined elements of both traditions. It was a family photograph unlike any other in the territory, a testament to the possibility of love transcending the artificial boundaries that history and prejudice had created. But for those who looked closely, there was also something more, evidence that healing was possible, that wounds inflicted by hatred could be mended by courage and compassion. As evening approached and the sky painted itself in shades of coral and gold, the three of them gathered around their dinner table for the evening meal. It had become their tradition to share stories from their day, to celebrate small victories, and discuss any challenges they faced. "The Henderson boy asked me today if you were really Apache," Grace reported to Taza between bites of stew. "I told him you were really my father, and that was more important than anything else." Taza reached across the table to squeeze her small hand. "What did he say to that?" "He said he wished his father was as good at fixing hurt things as you are." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple profundity of her daughter's response. Grace had grown up in a world torn by violence and mistrust, but she had emerged with a clarity about what truly mattered that put most adults to shame. "I received a letter from Colonel Harrison today," Sarah said, pulling a folded paper from her apron pocket. "He wanted us to know that the last of Morrison's associates has been arrested. The investigation is finally complete, and the families who lost loved ones to the false flag operations." Taza asked. "Compensation has been arranged through Congress. It won't bring back the dead, but it's acknowledgement that injustice was done." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in thoughts of how far they had traveled from that desperate morning when a child's cry had pierced through a warrior's grief and begun the transformation of three broken lives into one healing family. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace yawned and announced that it was time for Anna to go to sleep. She kissed both her parents good night, a ritual that never failed to move Taza, who remembered when such simple affection had seemed lost forever. "Sweet dreams, little warrior," he whispered as he tucked her into bed. "Sweet dreams, Papa," she replied, the word carrying all the love and trust that had rebuilt his world. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the desert, their voices carrying ancient songs of survival and adaptation. But inside the small homestead, three people who had learned to create family from the ashes of loss settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that love was indeed stronger than hatred, and that courage could indeed change the world, one heart at a time. The last thing Sarah saw before sleep claimed her was the photograph on the mantel, its silver surface catching the dying light of the fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose hope over fear, connection over separation. But tonight, they were simply a family, safe in the home they had built together, surrounded by the peace they had fought so hard to achieve.